little bit now. Try to...
It's so funky. Okay. All right. So someone left me 2 questions. I believe it's 2. Yeah. All right. Let me just read the questions. So I've been witness to hardworking people who didn't have the chance to attend events like the one, like this one, I guess, and it was clear that they have been born into a precious life with a high potential to reach a peaceful mind. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you don't attend an event like this, it doesn't mean you don't have a precious human right. I'm saying with this precious human life, I'm not saying that if you attend this event, you necessarily have a precious human life, and if you don't attend, you don't. That's not what I was trying to say. I was trying to say that there's like a list of leisures, a list of opportunities that you usually go through, and if you have all those opportunities, those leisures, those freedoms, then it is considered that you have a precious human life. Of course, it's not that clear cut, but I mean, in general, it basically just means you have certain opportunities, an openness, a mental openness, you physically are able to do this, you have certain freedom in terms of you have the time to engage in actions. So it means that you have the leisure and the freedom to transform your mind. Whether you utilize it or not is different. So that can include many different people. I mean, it could even include people who have to work all the time and still utilize their time to transform the mind. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to make like black and white kind of statements here. Really, in the end, it comes down to common sense. So if someone has the ability and the potential in this very life, in the sense that they have the circumstances or the facilities to really transform their mind, and they make use of it to some degree, you would say precious human rebirth. Does that make sense? Yeah. Whereas other people may even have a precious human rebirth and just still be very interested in just other things. Yeah. So it doesn't mean to have to come to an event like this. Absolutely not. And then there's another question. It says, isn't pervasive conditioned suffering the reason or the reasoning for suffering of suffering and suffering of change? I don't understand why it is considered as a third category. Yes, that's very important. It's true. Basically, the pervasive conditioned suffering is the cause of the other two. It's the basis, it's the foundation. It's almost like you mention the first two specifically and then say, well, the reason the other two are there is because you have the third type. So it's kind of like looking at the same thing from a different angle, if you like. In a way, actually, the first 2 types are also a pervasive conditioned suffering. It's almost like the last type includes the first 2. The last type is everything. I mean, when you talk about the suffering of suffering, it's one of the mind, it's one of our awarenesses, it's one of our aggregates, if you like, one of the things that make us. So it's a pervasive conditioned suffering. Our suffering of suffering is a part of us. And whatever is a part of us is a pervasive conditioned suffering. So really, like, the last type includes the first 2. But the reason it is explained separately is, well, first of all, suffering is something we don't desire. So real sufferings, real problems. So we mention those separately. And then we say, even our happiness, even our ordinary happiness, which seems to be the opposite of suffering, so therefore something desirable, even that is limited. Let's be realistic, right? Not saying let's not enjoy it. No, we can enjoy it. But let's be realistic with regard to how much satisfaction it can really provide us. And then let's see, why do we experience suffering of suffering? Why do we have suffering of change? Well, because we have this mind and body. So that's the third type. Yeah. So they're not just totally separate categories without any overlap. No. It's just it serves a purpose to think of them along those lines, to go from, I don't want the suffering of suffering. I don't want that. Okay, very clear. But even my suffering of change is limited. So my attachment to that suffering of change could be an obstacle for me to experience something greater. So what is lying underneath the suffering of change? What is responsible for that? Having this limited mind and body, the third type. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes.
But I can think, I agree that the third one includes, it's the cause and includes the first two, but it's broader. I can think of examples which are not included in the first two and still suffering and belong to the third category.
Yes, you're right. I'm saying the last one is is like this pervasive category. Well, here another reason for saying pervasive, in the sense that Leora is right. She says she can think of sufferings that are neither part of the first type nor of the second type, but are included in the third type. Yeah, so the third type, actually you could say there's one type of suffering, pervasive condition suffering. And then examples of that are the first and the second. But what I'm saying is it's not so much about generating categories. It's either A, B, or C. It's about emphasis. Let's understand suffering of suffering. Let's understand even our happiness is in the nature of suffering. And let's understand what is the foundation for that. Yeah? Yes, please?
I'm trying to think of the forecast.
Mm-hmm. Forecast. Mm-hmm.
You present, you as the Buddha present a very bleak present, and and you say the only way we can get out of this is by reaching nirvana, or more than that, Buddhahood.
Mm-hmm. But there's reduction on the way. Like really, like it's not like saying suffer, 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 and then if you're lucky you get out of it one day. It's like even without liberation, just recognizing our happiness right now as being limited. Sorry, I know you're not finished yet, but just want to mention that for those who misunderstood this possibly.
As long as you reach, as long as you were born.
Yes.
Human or animal or whatever we know, type of body and mind, you have potential for suffering.
Not everyone. There are beings who are born in a similar way like us, and there's no more suffering. Bodhisattvas, for example, who only come in order to benefit us. So being born in an ordinary way, like without any control. I'm talking about just ordinary kind of birth, like in our case, under the control of afflictions and contaminated karma.
But I didn't reach the question yet.
Okay. Sorry.
If the only way to escape this suffering
Yes.
is reaching nirvana,
Mm-hmm.
and so what is my forecast? I mean, how many people you're living and studying in the world capital for nirvana, and people around you have the best chances in the world to reach nirvana.
I'm not
How
sure.
many people do you or people around you know or think that have reached nirvana? So that maybe gives us maybe some.
I understand what you mean. Some realistic kind of perspective. Okay. Well, first of all, trust me, you may think we live in the capital of nirvana or whatever. The thing is, like, Jisuma Tenzin Palmo once said this, very true. When we had like a meeting with nuns, and she said, some people think when you have the vows, you become like a different person. Really, I mean, all you have is like you have vows, and you have a different dress and a different haircut. You don't change. So you see, the change does not come about by dressing in a weird way and having a particular haircut and certain vows. It can be helpful for some people, but not for everyone. So I don't think as a monk or nun, you're a better practitioner. It just totally depends on the person. The distractions can be just as great. Becoming a monk and nun can be for some people beneficial because the things that distract them would otherwise distract them too much to be able to practice Dharma, well, they're now kind of temporarily separated from. So they can, it's a bit like if I'm obese, I'm not going to sit in a cake shop all day long, right? I may be able to do that. If I have a strong determination, I can be working in a cake shop. I can be a professional cake taster and still taste one piece, and that's it. Okay? But if I don't have that ability, then I want to be a monk or nun, because it just keeps me away from certain temptations. That's it. It's just a lifestyle. It's not better or worse than anything else. It's just, it is more conducive for teaching the Dharma, because you're supposed to learn the Dharma. That's your job, right? But it doesn't mean you get closer to nirvana. Okay? So in order to become a Dharma teacher, yes, you have all the conditions. But I'm not claiming that it's better to be a practitioner, because being a practitioner just depends on the mind. You can do it being a truck driver. You can do it in any situation. Depending on the person, it may be just as beneficial. So I'm saying, for example, as a family man, like you have a family, I mean, that's an amazing altruistic way of living your life. I mean, it can, of course, lead to attachment and so forth. Well, trust me, monks and nuns are just as attached. You're just not attached to your children. You're attached to something else, right? So the attachment always finds. The attachment is the problem, not the objects. Mind just attaches naturally to the most bizarre things, okay? To a certain type of maroon or whatever, right? Anyway, so yeah, so what I'm trying to say here is, don't think you cannot live in the West. Don't think you cannot live an ordinary life and not reach nirvana. And the problem is, I don't know who's reached nirvana. If someone comes up to me and says, I reached nirvana, I'm going to think they're crazy. And I'm not going to believe them, probably. So there's really not much point if you tell me you've reached nirvana. Well, if you don't tell me you've reached it, how do I know you've reached it? You know, I mean, I can only see from my own limited... It's a bit like, you know, if you're a kindergarten student and you meet a professor, you cannot fathom their qualities, right? As a kindergarten student, I look at a professor and they tell me, I'm really learned. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means. So for me right now, with my limited mind, I naturally see others as limited. I mean, I see the Dalai Lama as having faults, you know? It's like, I mean, not really in that way, but sometimes His Holiness explains something, I'm thinking, I would explain that differently. I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? Right? It's just that natural tendency. You know, someone asks a question, His Holiness answers it, and I'm like, I would have said, I mean, come on. Right? And then the person later on tells me, that was exactly what I needed to hear. And I'm like, oops. Okay. So there's like a natural tendency that I think, oh no, that was not a good explanation. But of course, for that person, it was the best. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know who, I mean, I believe someone like the Dalai Lama has reached nirvana. Well, he says I'm just an ordinary man, just an ordinary monk. I can only look at him and I definitely notice he's really special. So much beyond what I could ever be. But what does it mean to be a Buddha? That's too mind-boggling. I mean, it's like like a kindergarten student trying to understand what it means to be a Nobel Peace Prize laureate in chemistry or something. Am I making sense? So beyond us. So it's very difficult, yeah.
The deal that is offered here.
The deal is offered here. The problem is not even offered. You yourself offer, yeah.
Buy a lottery card.
Yeah.
You don't know the odds. You cannot know the odds.
Mm-hmm. True.
All your life, work for it.
You see, the thing is, you're right. So you don't know whether it's possible or not. That's true. This is like, I can hear myself talk, and I can totally understand where you're coming from, because it almost seems like I'm talking about something you have no taste of. I'm talking about the limitation of your suffering of change, and almost like saying that's limited, aim for something greater, but I can't give you a taste of it. I myself don't have a taste of it. So the only advice I can give here is just try it out. Just try it out. I mean, take a step at a time. And what is so wonderful, I think, about this technique here is it's not, like I said earlier, it's not like you are suffering. Suddenly there's nirvana. It's not like that. You're suffering, and then a little less, and a little less. And you get happier, and happier. And as you get happier, you're encouraged to go on. And you just continue on, and, you know, whether there's nirvana or not, in the end, it's kind of like you get happier in the process. So your life becomes more meaningful, you become kinder, you become more honest. I mean, you change. You have more friends. So things just become easier and nicer. I mean, your life becomes better. And so that's what makes you go on. and continue. And then you start generating compassion. And then it's not about yourself any longer, but you also look at others and you feel, wow, I've changed. I'm not the same person anymore. I can give so much to others. The energy I've spent previously only to work for my own benefit, now I can work for others. And then you have the reward of that, making others happier. So it's a bit like, I sometimes say jokingly, practicing the Dharma is a stairway to happiness. It's like steps, not stairway to heaven, stairways to it kind of, you feel happier in the process. So I think that's a reward. That's the greatest reward I believe there is. So I meet people, like, I'm not saying myself, but I meet people who really practice sincerely. And when they started off, they had this problem and that problem and anxiety and fear. And over the years, those went away. And they just became more happy, more satisfied, more content, more open, more perceptive. They changed, right? Inspiring to others and so forth. So even in the end, there's no nirvana. I don't care. I mean, in the end, I don't worry about it, right? So if, like, let's say this was all like a big conspiracy by I don't know, some non-Buddhists to just make people happier, that's fine with me. It's still a win-win situation. My point is that, right? It's still a win-win situation. So if in the end we always be in cycle existence, or let's say there's even no future lives. I mean, honestly, I'd be very happy there are no future lives. Seriously, I'm the first one to say, yes, I don't want any future lives. So then if in the end this was just a conspiracy, I mean, at least I have no regret when I die. And if there is future lives, and I continue to be born and there's no way out, well, at least I found a way to make it reasonable, to be happier than I was definitely when I was before I met the Dharma. See what I'm saying? So the point is not about believing 100%. We can't. So it's a long process. It's a long process. And my advice would be just to take a step at a time. And if you feel happier and you feel you were able to deal with problems you weren't able, well then, continue. And then if you find it doesn't work, well, look somewhere else. Yeah, it's just an offer. It's just the Buddha gave an offer. He said we're not supposed to suffer. And here I'm showing you something to get out of it. Right? And all we need to do is try it out. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. But going back to suffering. Some more suffering. Okay. Anyway, I can go through it quite quickly. I believe I took too much time even in the morning. So anyway, so the suffering of encountering that which is unpleasant. All right, we've already mentioned anything we don't want. The suffering of encountering the things we really don't want. Okay? And this is different too. I just had the conversation with someone during our break. What's your name? Sorry. Jonathan, yeah, I'm sorry. I want to get to know your name so I don't just refer to you as the person. So Jonathan and I had a talk about, for example, suffering can be useful, right? Suffering can be helpful. Yes. You see, suffering in itself, there's nothing wrong with suffering. It can help us to grow. I mean, if you exercise, there's a certain suffering, but it helps you to have more long-term happiness. So you may accept short-term suffering in order to have long-term happiness. Okay? But the problem is when we see it as suffering, we don't accept it, and then there's displeasure. So when we push it away, so then there's the suffering of encountering that which is unpleasant. Of course, if I see that which is unpleasant as a means to grow, well, wonderful, then it becomes a cause of happiness. Okay? All right. It's a bit like the obnoxious person. Okay? I mean, we see the obnoxious person as a person we don't like. We see them as an obstacle. We don't like them. But we can actually make them our teacher. Very helpful to have obnoxious people around. Because how would we practice patience without them? Who is there to love? I mean, it's very difficult to generate love towards a person who is obnoxious. So if we can manage to love them, wow, that's a powerful achievement. So we need obnoxious people, right? So suffering and obstacles, they can be very positive, but only when we turn them into something positive. But right now, when something unpleasant happens, we experience suffering. This is what this mentions. This is what this talks about. So the suffering of this, of encountering that which is unpleasant, the suffering of the separation of what is pleasant, and then the suffering of not getting what we want. All sufferings, right? Encountering that which is unpleasant, being separated from what we like. So it's a bit like that. We worry because we don't get something, and when we have it, we worry we lose it. That's life, isn't it? Okay. And then the suffering of, so this is also part of the suffering of not getting what we want. So you can read those. Those are very self-explanatory. It's very easy to understand this. And then lastly, it says again, the suffering of having the 5 aggregates. Okay? There's one verse I'd like to cite. I really like this verse. It's one of my favorite verses. So it's part of the suffering of the separation from what is pleasant. Because whatever pleasant thing there is, we will always be separated from it. Let's face it. Whatever pleasant object there is, I mean, I'm saying ordinary, in like an ordinary kind of life, whatever pleasurable object there is, we will lose it. So if we know that right from the beginning, we have that already, that ability to let go right from the beginning. So we're able to enjoy it for as long as it lasts. And when it goes, it's okay. The suffering is just less. That's what I'm saying. It's only for our own sake. So, and this is something the Buddha himself has said. This is this quote on page 29 from the basis of discipline. It's a text on the kind of moral conduct, or the Vinaya in Buddhism. So the basis of discipline. It says, the end of accumulated things is depletion. So in other words, the end of something that comes together is it depleting again. So whatever comes together will go out of existence again. So the end of accumulated things is depletion. The end of things that are high is a fall. So whatever goes up high will come down again. Right? I mean, like, however high you go, you come down again. So if you have a very high position, well, if you die in that position, you lose your position. And if you don't die as like a president, well, then they land a coup, or they, I don't know, vote someone else. So however high you go, in the end you come down again. So the end of something coming together is that thing dispersing again. The end of things that are high is them coming down. The end of meeting is separation. And the end of life is death. But what I like is it goes the other way around too. The end of depletion is accumulation. The end of fall is going high. The end of separation is meeting. And the end of death is life again. It goes on like that. So the people we of course separate from in this lifetime, we also meet again. Right? It's actually, I mean, if as long as we're in samsara, we keep meeting, we keep separating, meeting, separating. So that's an important part of life. So it's not just there's only beginning and then there's a beginning and then end, and after the end. You see, we have a very weird way of looking at time, at looking at life. For example, the way I like to explain this, for example, we always just look at one angle. For example, birth. We look at birth as a beginning and death as an end. And it's a finite thing. It's like it seems to be an intrinsic kind of just a beginning with regard to birth and just an end with regard to death. But actually death is the end of one thing and the beginning of something new. Birth is the beginning of something new, but also the end of something else, the death of something before. In fact, each moment is a birth and a death. Each moment is something new arising and the end of something else. So actually it's totally relative, right? When we talk about death, we only look at it from one angle, the end of this lifetime, but the beginning of something new. Am I making sense? So each day, like every night we go to sleep, it's a bit like we die, there's like a death, end of previous day, and a new day starts, so it's the death of something else and the birth of something new. It's just a matter of perspective. Okay? So likewise, separation, yes, there's separation, but there's also coming together again. But what I'm saying is right now we're in a state where this happens uncontrollably and we suffer. This is the problem. There's nothing wrong with coming together and separation and change and all that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's only something wrong with our own mind that tries to hold on to things all the time. It's totally unrealistic. It's like holding on to quicksand. Trying to hold on to quicksand, right? Trying to build castles on quicksand. Impossible. Okay. Anyway, so this verse, I wanted to mention this verse because we hold on to that which accumulates. We hold on to it. But if we are aware, it'll disperse, it'll deplete. Okay. When we have a meeting with someone, we meet someone, but we will separate from them. Fine. Someone is born, great. They'll die one day. So that's just this constant change. Okay. Anyway, now the suffering of not getting what we want. That's also self-explanatory. And then the suffering of having the 5 aggregates. This is just saying again the same thing. The suffering of pervasive conditioned suffering. Okay, so it's the same thing. Here it says, just mentions a few other things. So it's this mind and body is the vessel of future suffering, of present suffering, is the vessel of the suffering of suffering, and the suffering of change, and the vessel of the all-pervasive conditioned suffering. That's it, right? It's really just saying same thing again and again. It's just looking at it from different angles because there's so many different ways of understanding this. Okay, so just having this mind and body. I don't believe there's anything that's really important here, having a mind and body that is under the control of ignorance. That's what we're talking about, misperception of reality. So a mind and body that's under the control of the misperception and other afflictions, we constantly accumulate negative actions, negative karma of body, speech, and mind, and that will induce problems and difficulties in the future, in the later part of this life and in future lifetimes. So this is from the point of view of this mind and body is a vessel in the sense it serves as the basis to create new problems and suffering for ourselves, potentially, unless we're careful. And also, of course, from the point of view of the suffering we have right now, it's also because of this mind and body. Then the suffering of suffering, and yeah, all this has already been explained. And there's one part I wanted to mention because it's in this context here. That explains again the contaminated, the pervasive condition suffering. So basically the summary of everything we've been saying is that our mind-body complex is comparable to an open wound, sensitive to the touch and always ready to hurt. Okay, so with the misperception of reality, there's this constant potential to suffer. And our pleasant experiences are like putting cold water or cool water on the wound, which temporarily relieves the pain. So really, like when we say it's in the nature of suffering, the way I look at it, and I haven't seen this really described in the text, but it's almost like our misperception of reality and our suffering are very strongly connected in the sense that our misperception gives rise to our suffering. Now, our misperception is not natural. It's not natural. What it perceives is not in accordance with reality, and it's not actually supposed to be there. We're just misperceiving reality. So in the sense that our mind has the ability to know things as they really are. It totally has the ability to understand reality as it really is. And of course, this is obvious, or this becomes understandable in the fact that we can know so much about science, about mathematics, and so forth. So we actually have the ability to know. But our problem is on a very deep level, on a very profound and subtle level, we don't exactly understand how phenomena really exist. We have a sense that phenomena exist independently, intrinsically, objectively, over there, not dependent on our mind. And that basic misunderstanding leads to all our suffering. And the stronger that misunderstanding, the stronger our suffering. So as long as that pervasive misperception of reality is there, the pervasive condition that we experience is suffering. So remove one, you remove the other. Okay? So that's the Buddhist idea here. So really saying that even our pleasant experiences are a type of suffering is just saying underneath it there's this constant suffering, and it's just a brief relief. Right? You can put some cooling water on a wound, and then for some time there's a relief, and then you need to put something else and something else. And that's what we do in our lives. We go from one thing to the next, just putting temporary kind of medication on our wounds. Okay? So it's like putting cool water on the wound, which temporarily relieves the pain. However, as long as we have an open wound, in other words, as long as we have our misperception of reality, pleasant relief from the pain cannot last and will inevitably change back into pain. So if we continue with the same object, so however wonderful something is, if we continue with that same object, if that was really in the nature of happiness, that object, our happiness would grow exponentially, but it doesn't. And it would grow accordingly. So if the object was really able to provide us with happiness, then it would increase the more we experience the object. But since it doesn't, it shows the objects that we usually seek happiness in cannot provide this happiness. They can only provide a temporary relief from the state of suffering we experience. So we need to remove the cause to our suffering, and then no matter what we experience, we be happy. It doesn't depend on external circumstances. So from a Buddhist point of view, external conditions don't really provide us with happiness or suffering. Happiness comes from within. And if we remove the misperception of reality, it'll be there naturally. Okay? But that's so difficult to do that. All right, let's just continue. So therefore, even if for the time being we're happy and content, circumstances can easily change and transform our happiness into dissatisfaction and misery. Even though our pleasurable experiences induce desire and attachment, nothing in any of these experiences has an essential nature of pleasure. Contaminated pleasant feelings arise from the temporary relief from suffering. They are mere lightening of the burden and are then labeled happiness. It is only in comparison to previous feelings of displeasure and pain that we call the temporary absence of those feelings happiness. Right? That's right now what we experience. So real happiness we cannot experience as long as there's the misperception of reality, as well as anger, attachment, and so forth. That's the claim here. So that's pretty radical. It's pretty radical. And then there's some quotes here on page 33. Lama Tsongkhapa says exactly the same thing here. And also the Buddha says in the Sutra for Nanda for Nanda for entering the womb. There's some mistake. No. Sutra for Nanda for entering the womb. That sounds a little weird. Yeah. Anyway, I don't remember the title right now in English, but the point is here that it's just saying like any kind of activity, for example, walking. If walking was in the nature of happiness, then the more we walk, the happier we would get. Or if sitting down. So the example they oftentimes give, it's a very nice example. I like this example. Well, it's not really something you experience in Israel much, but I think in Tibet you do. In Tibet, in a place of great altitude, in the sun it gets very, very hot, and in the shade it gets very, very cold. So they use this example. In Dharamsala, this is sometimes the case in the winter, not in the summer. But in Ladakh, for example, you have that experience. So you're in the shadow and it's cold, you feel cold. So then you walk into the sun. So the first moment you're in the sun, I feel so good after you've been so cold. But then the longer you stay in the sun, the hotter you get. And again, it turns into a suffering and you need to go back in the cold. That's a bit our experience right now. It's just a temporary relief from a state that is actually suffering. Now, what is very interesting, and I catch myself doing this all the time, we have an innate sense that this world is in the nature of happiness. And that's why when you, for example, let's say you create an organization, you start an organization, like a Dharma organization, and then people don't get along with each other, or things go wrong. And we're like, how is this possible? And the answer is, well, it's in the nature of suffering. It's samsara. So there's so much suffering around us, but we often like to just look on the bright side, which is good. It's nothing wrong with engaging in positive thinking. But we forget sometimes, we have a tendency to forget that this is in the nature of suffering. That even when you walk in a monastery, it's not perfect. People sometimes come to Dharamsala and they think, these monks and nuns, this idea that monks and nuns are all good practitioners and they are doing it better, that's unrealistic. And there's trouble in the monastery and there's infighting. They keep it secret. They don't really announce it, But trust me, I know from living in institutions where there's also conflict and this person doesn't get along with that. And you kind of try and make it work, but then something else comes up. So it's never perfect. It is impossible. It's in the nature of suffering. It's samsara. So the thing is, like, I catch myself thinking, oh no. You know, you hear of the private office of His Holiness, and you hear there's like a power struggle going on. I mean, naturally, right? It's samsara. And you go, oh no. There's almost like, oh, this should be different. Why should it be different? It's still within samsara. The people working there, samsaric beings. How could it be different? Then you hear about a nunnery or a monastery where there's some trouble going on. Or a Buddhist center or something. Oh, there's a Buddhist practice. No, it is still samsara. Let's be realistic. Yeah? And with that in mind, there's much more of an acceptance. Okay, there's going to be trouble. How can I find a solution? So there's not that frustration, the giving up. You don't give up. You just continue. Look at His Holiness. I mean, come on. His Holiness is the best example. I mean, he's full in samsara. He doesn't experience samsara himself any longer, I believe. His Holiness is beyond that. But he lives in a world where people still have this mind and body, and this mind and body really is samsara. I have my own samsara, you each have your own samsara. So, His Holiness still lives this, and things go wrong all the time, and he gives advice, he teaches, and people don't practice, they do a little bit. But for His Holiness, there's a little bit of improvement, that's all right. And if there's no improvement, he'll just continue. Just out of compassion and love. And the changes do take place. They are just extremely slow. They are very, very, very slow. And for us in the 21st century, this is difficult. Because we have highways, we have fast food, our computers get faster, our internet connections get faster, our sportless get faster, our drugs get faster. Pardon? Facebook is faster? Probably faster. I don't know. Everything. Pardon? No, and our mind goes faster too. Because we cannot watch movies out of the 40s any longer. Because the scenes are too long. We now need a murder solved in 20 minutes, you know. So the thing is, everything is faster. And for us, we don't even realize how much faster our life has become as opposed to our grandparents or great-grandparents. But the Dharma, the change to our mind, does not get faster. In fact, the faster our mind, the more distracted, the harder it is to focus, which is one of the main ingredients for Dharma practice. So the change to our mind is very, 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 very slow. If you engage in Dharma practice, you may do it for years and not notice any difference. But you just keep doing it. And sometimes you look back and you realize, oh, 10 years ago, I was different. And maybe your mom tells you, you're a nicer person now. You know, usually our moms notice when we're nicer to them, because Buddhism is all about appreciating your parents, respecting your parents, and so forth. And then these changes, your mom may notice, right? So change does take place, but it's very, very, very slow. So if you have that in mind, then you're more realistic. It's very important to be so realistic. And the problem is, we're very hard with ourselves. We're very hard with ourselves. I think Buddhism, His Holiness sometimes speaks about Buddhism. He talks about it, or it's not just His Holiness, many masters say, Buddhism can be divided into two. Dependent arising, the view of dependent arising, and the behavior of non-violence, or the conduct of non-violence. Dependent arising, very important, but here I'm talking about the conduct of non-violence. I believe, and non-violence is a weird word, it's just a literal translation of the Tibetan word. Buddhism is a religion of gentleness. Be gentle to yourself, number one. We have to be gentle with ourselves, and we're not gentle with ourselves. That's the beginning. When we Buddhist practitioners, we beat ourselves up initially. Oh, I got anger again. I'm such a bad person. I'm not meditating enough. I'm just a bad person. No, no, no. We need to be very gentle with ourselves, first of all. And there's this gentleness, this middle way between being gentle and not too lax. Right? To be disciplined when it's necessary, but to be forgiving when we can't do it the way we wanted to. So not to be so hard with ourselves. That's our problem in the West. Expecting immediate results or quick results and not being gentle with ourselves. Very big problem. So starting to be gentle with ourselves and then taking a step at a time. And then however long it takes, Right? And the thing is, we do feel happier in the meantime. That's the point I'm trying to make here. So anyway, all right. I don't know how I got from the shadow to that, but never mind. Somehow I did. So the point is here basically that there's this oh yes, I do remember now. So there's this underlying nature of suffering. So let's not be surprised, therefore. We do live in samsara. We have a limited mind and body. Let's take what we have. It's all right. That's what we have. And instant change is just impossible. All right. Okay. All right, there's another quote I'd like to give here on this occasion, because we talked about pleasure. This idea of suffering, of change, is just something I came across here. Ayadeva says in his 400 stanzas or 400 verses, for pleasure, when it increases, is seen to change into its opposite. Okay, so pleasure, when it increases, it may increase and then it goes into the opposite. When pain increases, it does not similarly change into its opposite. Okay, that's just something important to know about why what we call pleasure is really in the nature of suffering, because inevitably the suffering comes through again. All right. All right.
Why is the second part true?
Pardon?
Why is the second part true? Everything changes. Even pain changes. It may change to the worse. It may also change to the better.
Can you give me an example? I mean, like, for example, like say you torture your body. You sit in a certain position and you...
Pain in my hand.
Yeah.
Go away.
Yeah, but go away doesn't mean it becomes pleasure. I'm talking about, like, you see, with any kind of pleasurable experience that we have right now, if we keep with this object, the same object, like you sit down, right? You sit down and it gives you great pleasure because you've been walking around a whole day long. And it seems so pleasurable when you sit down. If you keep sitting down in the same position, it will definitely become suffering. But when you sit down and you continue sitting, it will not turn into pleasure. If you're very lucky, maybe, but you must be very lucky. But most of the time, it just gets worse, and you probably damage your knees, and at some point, you can no longer sit down cross-legged. Let's say you sit like that for a year. I think you probably, someone has to give you surgery to straighten your legs, and that's it.
It's the same thing as going from -10 to 0.
Pardon?
It's the same thing as going from -10 to 0. All of our pleasures and pains are relative as long as we have this mind and body.
Yes, you're right. They're pleasurable. Of course, what we interpret as pain and pleasure, I mean, in the end, the kind of experience in your body is just a sensation, and we interpret it as pain or pleasure. But as long as we do that, then it's our reality. Of course, eventually we go beyond that, and then we don't interpret it any longer in that way. But as long as we do, right? I mean, suffering in itself is it's not like a suffering inherently or intrinsically. It's just a certain type of experience, and we label it as suffering or whatever, right? But first of all, we have the experience right now, however relative it is, and we don't want it. And so therefore we suffer. Am I making sense?
No, what I mean is that when we go from terrible pain
Yeah.
into being just miserable, we feel better.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Actually, it's all miserable and pain. It's all misery, but it's just different degrees of it. So the point is here, it's not actual happiness. We don't experience actual happiness. So when